Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy, and I'm joined today by guest contributor Ed Hammond from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. Welcome, Ed.
Hello, everyone.
So, Ed, you recently spoke at LLG's leadership conference on the subject of governance and scrutiny. How did that session go, and what were some of the main sort of themes coming out from our membership?
Yeah, it was an interesting and a useful session. Always enjoy talking to MOs and other legal professionals about scrutiny sort of issues. It's one of these issues, the quality and effectiveness of scrutiny, that often bubbles up amongst other things. It's rarely the sort of the most important thing on a monitoring officer or sort of head of governance kind of list, but often emerges as a pressing factor in response to kind of political problems or simply sort of external pressure when you, for example, have a corporate peer challenge and the peer challenge team say, oh, you know, we've had a look and we think you probably could use some improvements in your scrutiny arrangements. Can be one of these things in terms of quality effectiveness that creep up on you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think the role of scrutiny, for whatever reason, isn't always given the priority it deserves. But what would you say is the danger in only playing lip service to scrutiny?
I think, and this is less of an issue, I think, than it used to be. But certainly, I think it's quite easy, if you're not paying a huge amount of attention to it, as many don't, to see sort of little impact from it. To sort of see, well, what's this function doing? These committees are meeting regularly, and councillors are taking reports on things, but fundamentally, what's it doing? And I think it's quite easy to assume that. For it to work, it's kind of down very much to scrutiny councillors themselves and the officers supporting to kind of make it work. And you sort of say, well, why isn't it working properly? Whereas actually, it's much more about the whole council understanding what it's there to do. So if you are dismissive of it, if you don't think it's particularly effective, and if you're vocal about that, saying, oh, it doesn't work properly, then particularly if you're in a leadership position, people take their lead from you, and so they don't take it seriously as well. And you create a vicious cycle where scrutiny is not particularly effective because people don't perceive it as being very effective, and so therefore it isn't very effective. I think you've got to break that by saying, by articulating more meaningfully what is it actually here to do, what is its fundamental role. And what we always talk about is, well, it's about opening up potentially uncomfortable political and other conversations, bringing in a wider range of perspectives into decision making and into the review of the effectiveness of decision making. So when you look at councils that perhaps don't work particularly effectively, that aren't especially responsive to change, are slow to transform, and if you look at councils that have sort of failed in sort of inverted commas, those are councils that don't have the culture within them that's about challenge, that's about questioning, that's about being prepared to hear alternative views. And scrutiny is a really good sort of institutional way of doing that in a way that sort of is still fairly safe. It's also a way of innovating. So you can ask councillors through scrutiny to look into new and different ways of doing business in certain areas. Councillors can try and work across party to find unusual solutions to common problems that often officers as professionals may not have thought of. Councillors' perspective as elected representatives really closely connected to local people in a way that, even if you're an officer living in a place, you're not going to have the direct day-to-day connection with local people that those councillors are going to have. And it's a wider range of councillors than just talking to your cabinet member. And that itself, just on its own, brings you a fresh and different kind of insight and perspective, a different kind of insight to that which you'd otherwise have. But it doesn't happen naturally, it doesn't happen overnight. And what you have to do in a council, if it's not working, is think, well, why is that? Is there something about my behaviour that I can change? Is there something about what CMT's attitude towards scrutiny is that we can collectively try and resolve? Is there something about how Cabinet engages with scrutiny that we can change in order for scrutiny to fulfil its promise more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, there's something around educating individuals, I think, to really understand the purpose of scrutiny. I think that's correct. Because, as you said, we do see problems within scrutiny where we have councils that are failing. And you're right that it does open up decision making to new perspectives. Do you think, and it's a bit like the MO role over the years, do you think the scrutiny is sort of seen as a kind of, oh, you know, we're trying to get something done here and you're just preventing us from doing it? Do you think there's something psychological within some councils, or it's almost, rather than sort of business critical, a slight annoyance that we're not able to push forward our agenda because of the role of scrutiny? Do you think that exists?
Yeah, I think in part it does, because it can act as a kind of a magnet for political opposition to things, certainly. So in some councils where you know, there's a strong opposition group, and particularly where you've got a situation where you've got an opposition who might previously have been in the administration. So if you're a contestable council where you know, your opposition, you know, your chairs of scrutiny might be people who, until, you know, a few weeks or months ago may have been your cabinet members, they can cause all sorts of challenges because of course they know where the bodies are buried. And but that brings with it its own benefits, because it allows you to say, well, you know, how can we use the experience and expertise of these people to kick the tires of things that we're trying to develop? Because certainly, you know, if you're getting grief about policies now, then it's inevitable that you'll get more grief down the line if you hadn't gone through that process. You know, you get problems in the public, you get problems in implementation, you get other political problems. And I think it's best to kind of try and rehearse some of those issues in scrutiny, you know, as a way of trying to resolve things as they emerge, than waiting and saying, oh, well, you know, we can close this down somehow. You know, risky though it is, and sort of annoying and frustrating though it can appear, it's a useful safety valve, I think, in dealing with those more contentious and difficult topics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's let's change the subject, Ed, and let's talk about OFLOG.
Mm.
I gave a little laugh there purely because we do tend to talk about OFLOG quite a lot on the podcast, and actually, there's not, you know, we haven't really got going with it, and there's still a lot of detail to be coming out in relation to how OFLOG is really going to work in practice. But what we do know is that in relation to audit, some would say that there's a little bit of a crisis with audit at the moment within local government, and I think that's probably right. And there had been some suggestion that oversight of audit was going to be given to the to OFLOG, but Minister Simon Hoare is reported now as saying that that's not going to happen, and there's going to be the establishment of a new kind of planned audit, reporting and governance authority. So what's your take on that, Ed?
So I gave evidence a couple of weeks back to the Levelling Up Housing Community Select Committee's ongoing inquiry into OFLOG, and I was on a panel speaking to MPs alongside Rob Whiteman of SIPFA, and what Rob made, you know, a really good point, I felt, about the potential for OFLOG cooperate as a systems leader on audit instead of ARGA. And I think there are sort of two main reasons why that's quite a compelling argument. Firstly, there just isn't a timescale for the establishment of ARGA at the moment, and that's you know, an ongoing worry. Secondly, ARGA has a far wider remit than just local government, so it's taking on the FRC's responsibility, sort of you know, wider sort of financial regulation, and will hold a responsibility for sort of corporate governance audit across the piece, not just in the local government sector. And it's an enormous role, and inevitably there's a risk that in doing so, that the local government aspects of that will not be sidelined, but will be treated with the level of priority they deserve. You've got to remember that the Redmond review was several years back now, and even Redmond highlighted the urgency of action on the topic. The Luck Select Committee did their own inquiry into local audits, which reported, I think, about a year ago. It highlighted extreme urgency in dealing with this, and yet we are still in this position where there isn't a clear and obvious way forward, and that's a real worry. So I can understand the logic of saying, well, you know, we have this new body established. Why not try and centralise, you know, some of the, you know, oversight around sort of performance audit reporting around this body? I understand government's reticence in doing so, because I think if you were going to do that, you'd probably need to establish OFLOG on a kind of statutory footing. It would need more obvious independence than it does now. I think government wants to keep OFLOG quite close in to DLUC. You know, you see that the letter that came out announcing productivity plans that went to all chief execs in the country, I think last week or the week before, that letter didn't come from the chief exec of OFLOG, it came from the minister of DLUC. And I think that demonstrates what government is trying to do with OFLOG. It's ostensibly a kind of separate body, but it's very much part of government. And I think if you were going to create a systems leader role for OFLOG, it would need to be separated out. So I can understand why there's a resistance to doing that, but I think it may prove to be a mistake. And we shall see what happens. We have a general election coming up this year. It looks possible / likely that we're going to have a change in government. Now, I think should Labour be elected, I don't think that we're going to see OFLOG being sort of swept away. I think they're going to want to keep. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say I agree with you. I don't think they will sort of disband the concept of OFLOG. I think they will continue with it, but I think it will look slightly different. But I'm interested to hear your views on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it will look different, and I think you may well see it looking and feeling more independent. The worry is that I think a lot of people who are in senior positions in the sector are people who were around and who started their career when the Audit Commission was around, and inevitably when we sort of look and see what solutions might work in the future, there's always this thing that drags us back to saying, we should just set the Audit Commission back up again. And the fact that we're still talking about this and people are still talking about this now just demonstrates, 15 years on nearly, the longevity of it as a concept. And I think it's quite dangerous to kind of be too backward looking. I don't think we want to move into a space where we're trying to re-establish the old kind of almost kind of 1990 style kind of new public management model of audit oversight reporting performance that we used to have pre-2010. I think the world has moved on rightly, but I think we do need some systems ownership at the centre. So we need not a body that's going to reach into investigating performance in every single council in the country, but an organisation like OFLOG that has responsibility for making sure the system is functioning healthily and taking actions that are system-wide. Now, the National Audit Office does some of that. So it conducts thematic reviews into value for money in local government. So it doesn't look into individual sort of councils' issues, but it looks at things thematically. I think that's quite a good model because it says we're not going to go and do our own independent research. So I think this stuff about government trying to do the early warning conversation stuff, trying to build its own basket of metrics, I think will probably prove to be a little bit of a dead end. I think the most sustainable model for me is one that looks like a body like OFLOG, whether that's called OFLOG or something else, whether it's owned partially by the sector, whether it's independent of government, whatever it looks like, of having a responsibility for kind of curating and knitting together the insight that exists, and identifying from that existing data where there might be systemic issues that are arising, and then supporting government and the sector nationally to take action on those systemic issues where they're identified. So it provides a kind of, broadly speaking, a kind of common evidence base for us so that we make sure we have an accurate understanding of the kinds of issues that are affecting the sector. For me, that feels like the most proportionate kind of approach. But I think OFLOG as currently established does and will do a lot of that. So it's got these sort of three main elements. It's there to inform, to warn, to support. I think the inform and support side are lean towards that direction, which is kind of good. The warn stuff is slightly more tricky because that's the stuff where the productivity plans come from. That's the stuff where the early warning conversations come from. And there you're asking an institution like OFLOG, which has about 100 civil servants working for it, which when you think about what it's being asked to do is not actually that many. It's a big ask to ask that group of people to keep direct tabs on 300 odd councils in England and understand independently their capability and the risk that they might fail. I think that we might see a shifting, I think, on that particular point.
Yes, well, I think resources has been a real concern for some time in respect of OFLOG, and actually, you know, how would they take in audit as well, unless that was going to be revised. But in respect of
Exactly.
the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority, you can completely understand why the sector is concerned about the public and private sector responsibilities, you know, merging those together. But I understand that the Director General for Local Government, Catherine Francis, who appeared before the committee, conceded that the legislation to bring in the authority was unlikely to happen this Parliament. So it will, again, when we talk about the potential change of government, you know, the risk of it, well, what the likelihood of it happening, I think, has to be called into question in any event, because we'd have to see what if it is the Labour Party, what it is they do about that moving forward. Now, elections are on the horizon, Ed, as we all know, and the Local Government Association, the Electoral Commission, and the Joe Cox Foundation have made a joint call for no abuse towards candidates during the upcoming elections, because there's real concerns around the impact on democracy and effective representation. This is all part of the debate not hate agenda, because as we know, the statistical information in relation to harassment and abuse, not just towards serving councillors, but actually those standing for election, is absolutely sky high. What are your concerns about the effects upon participation and engagement and proper democratic representation because of the risk of levels of abuse and harassment against standing candidates?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, part of a wider issue affecting kind of political discourse generally. And, you know, you talk about, you know, where's it, I suppose, does it come from? And we know that obviously I think the pandemic kind of accelerated it, but it was a trend that existed sometime before, this kind of polarization and inability to engage in kind of in discourse. You know, to an extent, it was always there. Those of us who worked in the sector for some time will, you know, be familiar with. There are always people locally and indeed councillors and politicians who are, you know, a combative, antagonistic, difficult. But I think there's something about social media. There's something about the perception that councillors are kind of, or need to be 24/7 available, that has, you know, made the situation worse. I think there's also something about where particular issues arise locally that cause that act as a lightning rod for contention and dissent. And you know, you think about things like low traffic neighbourhoods, you think about things in urban fringe areas about planning and housing targets. These are things that provoke an enormous amount of local frustration, and they're hooks for some people to kind of to attach them to exercise, you know, behaviour that's frankly unacceptable. So what we have to do is disaggregate what behaviour is kind of reasoned, you know, robust but reasoned and reasonable political debate, and where things go beyond the pale. I think part of the difficulty here is that, you know, different people's boundary lines are different. The LGA, obviously, its work, its campaigning work, is intended to identify, you know, the fact that, you know, there is and should be that clear demarcation. I think in terms of what councils can do to better support councillors, I think those of us in senior positions can do more to understand the pressures that councillors are under. I think it's quite easy to not take account of the fact that councillors are living and usually working in their communities. They will feel vulnerable sometimes when the council is doing something that's contentious, or, you know, unpopular, or perceived to be unpopular. I think that you know, councillors often feel they don't necessarily get the support they need, not the sort of, you know, the support in terms of time, but you know, the support in terms of, you know, moral support.
Yeah.
I think there are some things we can do to to kind of help with that. Part of that's about ensuring that councillors are supported to conduct surgeries more effectively. Part of it's about, this has been in the news recently, where being more proactive and removing councillors' personal details from official information. So a lot of councils still publish councillors' home addresses, councillors' own mobile numbers on many council websites. We may need to think again about doing that. I think that's quite sad, because there's something about that there's something great about the immediacy of being able to get directly in touch with your local councillor. But I think sadly in future, in some cases, we may need to mediate that contact. It's not something I would like to do personally. I know that a lot of councillors wouldn't either, but we may need to think about it. I think in terms of the wider agenda, in terms of there's something about what we do as a sector to explain, to inform local people about what it is that we do. I think the last 15 years or so, councils have cut the amount of resource they are putting towards comms, towards community engagement, and I think you can completely understand why that's necessary. But that happening at the same time that councils are making cuts to services, pushing forward things that may be controversial, does provide an environment where these kinds of behaviours can be fostered. And this isn't me putting responsibility back on the sector to act. It's about saying, we probably need to think again about wider issues around participation, involvement, how we can make difficult decisions through deliberation. So a lot of councils are starting to experiment with citizens' assemblies. So there's something about how can we open out decision making in a way that tries to diffuse some of this kind of behaviour. You're never going to get rid of it entirely, but there's something about, how can we do that in a way that will increase engagement. We will see on Thursday, but we expect turnout in the elections to be probably quite low once more, and that again I think speaks to an environment where there's just this lack of trust, this lack of sense of legitimacy, and what we can do to enhance that sense of legitimacy is to do more to encourage participation. It's expensive, and it costs money and time to set these kinds of things up, which is why a lot of councils have shied away from doing it. But I think in the interests of supporting and maintaining effective local democracy, it is something which increasingly I think we're going to have to think more seriously about doing.
Absolutely. Education, I think, really is the key for people to understand what it is their local authority is doing, why they're having to make certain decisions. I mean, if you've ever tried to access the financial information of councils and really understand it, and you've got all these disparate reporting documents, which I think is in some way what OFLOG is trying to do in terms of demystifying, but I'm not sure how effective that's going to be in practice. That remains to be seen. But one of the things that we know that kind of drives a lot of antagonism towards councillors is consistent allegations of corruption. Now, corruption is actually very low level generally. I mean, I know it does happen, and there's been really big headlines about it, but there seems to be this sort of misconception that if something's going on, or there's some sort of form of corruption, which is just not the case. And I think one of the really damaging things to the sector, in my opinion, and obviously LLG has campaigned along with ADSO for this for a long time, and other people in the sector, removing the ability to have remote meetings. I know they could be streamed, but that doesn't seem to have galvanized the kind of attention that was happening. I know we were in COVID, and I know people, perhaps had more time, but I think if these meetings were held, if remote meeting provision was put back into the sector, and they were being held sort of live and in a more kind of real-time experience, that would do an awful lot, I think, to educate people about the decision making within local authorities.
Yeah, I think it's about demystifying, about making this stuff more familiar. People perceive this stuff as being corrupt, because to them it seems like a black box. Decisions are made by the council as this kind of this monolithic kind of entity. People don't really understand the mechanisms by which those decisions are made. I think even within local government, I think there are plenty of people who don't really understand that either. I think that more visibility, more transparency of that nature, and I think for us also thinking about what that means for the way that we conduct meetings, I think is you know, is valid and valuable. You know, many councils provide spaces in meetings for petitions, deputations, that kind of thing. But often when you're a member of the public and you come and you ask public questions or you present a petition, I always get the feeling that you probably go away dissatisfied because you never get as a resolution or action or response often in that meeting. And I wonder if there's something more we can do around petitioning, around public questions that ensures that our response to those pressures feels a bit more real and substantive and meaningful than it perhaps does at the moment. So I think the remote meeting stuff, I think more virtual operations of stuff is absolutely a part of that, and I definitely think it is something that a new government would need to get a handle on. I don't think it's a campaign that's being run for the administrative convenience of lawyers, councillors, that kind of thing. I think it's actually pretty central to the credibility and legitimacy of local democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something about the user experience as well. I mean, if you're objecting, let's say, to a planning application, and obviously it needs to be, proceedings need to be conducted in a way that is a quasi judicial kind of forum. But if you're an individual who perhaps hasn't had much to do with the council, you've got to walk into a council chamber. They can be very imposing, very old-fashioned, almost courtroom like, and then you've got all these councillors sitting there, and I mean, that must be really imposing for lots and lots of individuals, and probably prohibitory then in them wanting to step forward and do it.
Yeah, it's a really intimidating experience. It's an intimidating experience for new councillors. There'll be people elected this week who obviously will their first interaction with these kinds of formal things may well be attending their first meeting full council towards the end of the month. And you can imagine going in as a member of the public or a brand new council into that environment, that highly formal environment, not really understanding the sort of rules of engagement or the rules of procedure. And I think there is something we can do about not making this stuff more loose and informal, but making it more accessible. And I think part of that is about making it more accessible in a way that we encourage people with different experiences and different needs to stand for election. So I think the fact of needing to come together physically is such a barrier for people with caring, professional, other responsibilities who've you get home from a full day's work, or you have a range of caring responsibilities, and then you've got to leave home at 6 o'clock and go to a 3-hour meeting from 7 till 10 for some purpose, whereas and it's such a barrier for people who otherwise would probably would be engaged positively to attend, and that itself, I think, provokes difficulties around legitimacy, because the people who engage are the people who've got the support networks in place, so the people who've got the the backing from parties from other parts of the local community to release their time in order for them to be councillors. And we want to get people with a wider range of life experiences in the mix, because they will, through the work they do, ensure that we're staying connected to local communities. And I don't think necessarily that we have that at the
moment. No, I agree. Well, it's always interesting to talk to you, Ed. Thank you ever so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure.
No problem. Yes, absolutely. We'll have to get you on again. And for listeners, don't forget you can now follow us on Spotify by searching for the LLG Grapevine podcast.